I lost my family before I understood what was happening. There was no explosion, no war, no single day that could be pointed to as the end. There was only absence. My husband was the first, then my two children, not all at once, one at a time, as if the world were teaching me how to lose slowly. At first they called it an environmental crisis, then climate collapse, then a systemic event. The names kept changing because admitting the truth was unbearable. The earth was not attacking us. It was stepping away. Crops failed without any apparent reason. The soil looked fertile, but nothing grew the way it used to. Water still flowed through the rivers, but it carried a strange metallic taste that no filter could remove. The bees disappeared first, then the birds, then the insects no one liked, but had always been there. By the time we noticed, silence had already settled in. My youngest was the first to ask, with that innocence that hurts more than any headline, "Mom, why doesn't the earth like us anymore?" I didn't know how to answer. Cities kept functioning for a while. Power, screens, optimistic announcements, saying everything was under control. They always say that when nothing is, but stepping outside was enough to see that something fundamental had changed. The trees along the sidewalks grew twisted, cracking the asphalt as if they no longer recognized the streets as part of their world. The wind blew too hot, then too cold, without warning. The seasons lost their rhythm, like a heart beating out of sync. My husband fell ill quickly. It wasn't a known virus. It wasn't bacteria. Doctors said his body seemed tired, as if it were fighting something invisible, and losing. Organs failed one by one, without inflammation, without infection. They simply gave up. It's as if the environment is no longer compatible. I heard a doctor whisper in the hallway, thinking no one was listening. She was right. We were just slow to accept it. When he died, hospitals weren't overcrowded yet. There was no chaos. There was a strange, almost polite calm. People still believed it was temporary, that we just needed to wait, invest, correct. We have always believed everything can be fixed. My children lasted a few more months. The oldest stopped eating, not from hunger, from lack of will. His body rejected food, as if it no longer recognized it as sustenance. My youngest had constant fevers, but no test could identify the cause. It was as if the world itself were rejecting the human body, cell by cell. I buried my family in soil that no longer felt like soil. Too dry to be fertile, too damp to be safe. A sick middle ground, like everything in that new world. Only then did governments begin to speak of real collapse. Not out of compassion, but numbers. When statistics showed that human mortality was rising, while other species adapted without difficulty, fear stopped being abstract. Animals migrated to unlikely places and survived. Plants sprouted among industrial ruins. Fungi covered abandoned cities with an efficiency that felt almost intentional. The earth was not dying. It was reorganizing itself, and we were no longer part of the plan. I remember the day stock markets were shut down, not because there was no money left, but because money no longer bought food, clean water, or breathable air. I remember people screaming in the streets, demanding solutions as if someone were still in control. But there was no enemy to fight, no negotiation possible, no mind to persuade. The earth did not hate us. It simply did not need us anymore. It was in this world, empty of explanations, full of consequences, that I kept living. Not out of hope, not out of faith, only inertia, like someone left behind after the party ended and the lights were turned off. And as I learned to survive alone, an idea began to spread among the few who remained. Perhaps the apocalypse was not the end of the earth. Perhaps it was only the end of humanity as part of it. After I buried my family, I began to observe the world with an attention I had never had before, not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. Survival required understanding the signs, and the signs were everywhere. People began to disappear from the cities, not in organized exoduses, not in planned migrations. It was quieter than that. One building stood empty. One street stopped lighting up at night. An entire neighborhood went weeks without a single sign of human movement. There was no violence in these abandonments. There was resignation. Systems were still running, but irregularly, like a body breathing out of habit rather than will. Electricity failed at unpredictable hours. Water arrived cloudy. When it arrived at all, the internet became a mosaic of static, interrupted messages, broadcasts dying mid-sentence. The connected world turned into an archipelago of isolated voices. News stopped talking about solutions and began talking about adaptation. That was the word of the moment. To adapt meant reducing consumption, reducing movement, reducing expectations. It meant accepting that the previous standard would not return, that perhaps it had never been sustainable. It was during this period that the first reports appeared, the ones no one wanted to release. Studies showing something disturbing. Areas with less human presence were recovering at an accelerated rate. Forests closed clearings in months. Rivers cleaned themselves when we stopped touching them. Animals returned to urban regions without difficulty. Life went on. We did not. There was also the other side, the one that never made it into official reports. People falling ill in strange ways, bodies reacting poorly to common foods, children being born with more fragile respiratory systems, elderly people succumbing quickly to small temperature variations. These were not epidemics. There was no identifiable agent. It was as if the environment itself had shifted frequency, and we were out of tune. I remember one night, when I walked to the edge of the city. There were no barricades, no warning signs, just an invisible boundary, where concrete gave way to vegetation. When I crossed that line, I felt something hard to explain. A pressure in my chest, a light vertigo, as if my body were entering a place where it was not welcome. I turned back quickly, breathless, with the humiliating sensation of being rejected by something I had always considered my home. Some called it punishment, others called it correction. Cults emerged preaching collective repentance, as if a well-rehearsed plea could convince the planet to accept us again. Others placed their faith in technology, talking about artificial domes, sealed cities, controlled environments. But even machines began to fail, when they depended too much on the world around them. Nothing seemed to work without the cooperation of the Earth, and the Earth simply no longer cooperated. Attempts at control became grotesque, dams that dried up on their own, hydroponic crops that rotted without cause, climate control systems that collapsed as if the air itself refused to be dominated. It was like fighting something that did not move, did not attack, did not respond. It simply persisted. I found other survivors, few, people like me, who had lost everything and learned to keep walking anyway. We did not form a true community. It was more a tense coexistence, built on minimal exchanges and long silences. No one wanted to put down roots. Roots now belonged to the earth. We spoke little about the past. We spoke even less about the future. The present demanded total attention. Each day was a simple calculation. How much effort to spend to stay alive, knowing the world seemed indifferent to it. It was in this setting that I heard, for the first time, the sentence no one else managed to disprove. The earth is not trying to kill us. It has simply stopped sustaining us. The difference between those two things is subtle and devastating, because an enemy can be fought. But how do you fight a planet that simply moved on without you? The phase of indifference did not last forever. There came a moment impossible to date precisely, when it became clear that Earth was not merely moving on without us, it was pushing us out. The changes stopped being subtle. Storms began to form without pattern. They respected neither seasons, nor forecasts, nor geography. Rain fell where it had never fallen before. Droughts swallowed regions that had always lived by rivers. The wind took on a surgical violence, tearing away roofs, towers, antennas, as if choosing its targets. Wildfires no longer spread the way they used to, they encircled. They formed rings of fire that left only one exit, and sometimes none at all. I watched an entire city be abandoned in 3 days. Not because of an attack, not because of explosions, but because the air became unbreathable. Not toxic, not contaminated, simply too heavy. Every breath demanded more effort than the body could give. People collapsed while walking. Animals fell first. Plants, curiously, remained green. It was as if the atmosphere had been recalibrated, without us in mind. Forced migrations began. Human crowds trying to cross areas that suddenly seemed to physically reject them. Forests where compasses went mad. Fields where the ground gave way beneath human feet, but remained firm for other forms of life. Coastal regions where the sea advanced in rhythmic waves, far too precise to be accidental. The word refuge lost its meaning. There were no safe places anymore, only places that were temporarily tolerant, and that tolerance shrank with each passing week. I lost people again. Not in the brutal way of war, but in a far crueler manner. They simply could not go on. Bodies failing not from disease, but from inadequacy. As if the human species had become an obsolete variable in a system that had moved forward. It was during this period that the first records appeared, the ones that never entered any official archive. Reports of people feeling pain when touching certain trees, of wounds that would not heal when exposed to the soil, of foods that once sustained us now causing strange reactions. Nothing consistent enough to become science, but constant enough to become fear. I felt it myself. One morning, I woke to the sound of birds, something too rare to ignore. I left the improvised shelter and walked a few meters farther than I usually dared. The air felt clean, almost inviting. I took one more step, and my body responded with immediate nausea. My heart raced, my vision darkened, my legs gave out. I fell to my knees on the ground, and in that direct contact, I felt the most disturbing sensation of my life, not pain, not threat, but conscious rejection. As if the ground itself knew I did not belong there. I crawled back, humiliated, trembling, with one certainty carved into my chest: we were no longer part of the system. Meanwhile, the natural world flourished, animals reproduced at absurd rates. Forests swallowed roads in weeks. Abandoned buildings became hives, nests, green reefs. Human absence was treated as accelerated healing. Where there had once been concrete and noise, there was now balance. Balance without us. Some still tried to react with violence. Explosives to open paths. Fire to push forests back. Improvised dams to hold the seas. Every one of these attempts ended the same way: quick failure, followed by worse consequences. It was like injuring a much larger organism, and being punished for it. I once heard someone say, with a clarity that froze me, "We're not being exterminated. We're being deprioritized," and that hurt more than any idea of revenge. Because there was no hatred. There was no clear intention, there was no villain. Earth was not attacking us. It was simply closing its doors, and we were still outside, knocking, begging, unable to understand that the party had ended a long time ago. It took us far too long to understand, because we insisted on searching for human intention in something that was never human. We spoke of Earth's revenge, of nature's fury, of retaliation for abuse. It was comforting to think that way, because hatred is understandable. Hatred allows guilt, redemption, negotiation. But what was happening had no emotion at all. It was correction. The Earth was not angry. It was adjusting. The data began to surface in fragments, coming from isolated scientists, forgotten stations, people who still tried to measure the world while it shifted beneath their feet. The pattern was always the same. Where human presence dropped close to zero, natural systems didn't just stabilize, they optimized. Shorter cycles. Less wasted energy, more diversity, less noise. We were the noise, and at some point in that silent adjustment, nature stopped tolerating us. As an exception, animals began to behave differently when encountering us. They no longer fled as before, they didn't attack in defense, they simply avoided us with precision. Migration routes curved around human settlements, as if they had been mapped centuries ago. Insects vanished from areas we still inhabited, while thriving just beyond our boundaries. It was as if an invisible line had been drawn. Crossing it had consequences. I saw this happen to a group that tried to move into an old agricultural region, believing the fertile soil could still sustain us. What they found wasn't dead land, but inaccessible land. Seeds didn't sprout. Water drained too quickly, escaping human roots. The sun felt harsher during the day, the cold more merciless at night. Nothing there wanted us. That was when some people began to speak of selection, not in the brutal sense we usually associate with the word, but in the coldest sense possible: efficiency. Those who survived were the ones who moved less, consumed less, left fewer traces. Anyone who tried to rebuild the old world, cities, factories, trade routes, vanished faster. The earth wasn't punishing human existence, it was eliminating excess, and that placed us before an unbearable question. The problem wasn't that we were alive, it was that we were too organized. Every attempt at collective recovery failed. Every large structure attracted collapse. The more we gathered, the more hostile the environment became, as if the planet reacted not to individual presence, but to the very idea of civilization. We began to live in silence, in small numbers, leaving no traces, and even that wasn't enough. I started noticing something even more disturbing. There were places where some humans managed to remain longer, not through strength, not through technology, but through emotional adaptation. People who had lost almost everything, people who no longer planned for the future, people who lived day to day, without ambition, without projection, without the desire to expand. They lasted longer. It was as if the earth accepted only those who no longer tried to dominate it. That realization shattered me from the inside, because it meant there would be no return to what we were, no rebuilding, no restoring humanity. The best we could hope for was to be tolerated as a controlled, declining species, a residue, and that was when I understood why I lost my family so early. They believed in rebuilding, in growing again, in reclaiming space. They still thought like old humans, conquerors of a world that no longer recognized us as legitimate. I survived because I learned to shrink. I learned not to leave deep marks. I learned to listen to the wind before walking. I learned to stop when my body told me to stop, not from exhaustion, but from warning. And even so, I knew this was not life. It was postponement. The earth didn't want us dead immediately. It wanted us irrelevant. And perhaps that was the most sophisticated punishment of all. There was no final great disaster. There was no last day. The end of humanity did not come with a scream. It came as a long, sustained whisper. We simply became few. Records ended. Stories stopped being written. Languages blended until they became noise, then silence. The world didn't need to expel us with violence. It only needed to leave us without a place. I walked through cities, swallowed by young forests, where roots pierced buildings, like veins reclaiming an abandoned body. I saw oceans cleaner than any human memory had ever recorded. I saw species return whose names existed only in ancient books, now rotting. The planet breathed better without us, and that hurt more than any individual loss. Because it meant that, despite all love, all art, all faith, all struggle, we were never indispensable. We were intense, creative, destructive, but not essential. I spent years living alone, not by choice, but because groups didn't last. Whenever more than a few people stayed in one place for too long, something shifted. The climate, the soil, the animals, even the air itself. It wasn't direct aggression. It was growing discomfort, like a body rejecting a foreign organ. I learned to move like a shadow, to sleep where the wind allowed, to eat only what was necessary. I became something between human and survivor, less a person, more a transient presence. Sometimes I encountered others like me. We didn't talk much, we didn't ask names. Identity had lost its importance when the future ceased to exist. We exchanged silence, gestures, water, then each went their own way, as if we knew that bonds lasting too long were also a kind of mark. There was a moment, only one, when I thought of fighting this. I thought of shouting at the world, of writing something grand, of leaving one final sign of humanity, a message, a monument, anything that said, we were here, but I understood the irony before trying. Everything we built to be remembered was exactly what erased us. Our legacy could not be another scar, so I chose a different kind of ending. I write this not to save humanity, nor to warn anyone. I write because I still feel, and feeling for now, is still allowed. Perhaps these words will never be read. Perhaps they will decompose with me, and that is fine. If someone, someday finds this account, do not see us as monsters, nor as martyrs. We were a species too young with too much power. We confused growth with entitlement. We confused domination with belonging. The earth did not hate us. It simply moved on. Now at dawn, I watch a valley that was once a road. There is light mist, birds I don't recognize, trees growing where cars died. The world is not sad. It does not miss us. And for the first time since I lost my family, I do not feel anger either. I feel something harder to accept, peace without permission. Perhaps the planet's future is a world without human stories. Perhaps our greatest contribution was disappearing in time, not to take everything with us. If this is the end, let it be so. Silent, small, finally, in balance. And I, one of the last voices, leave this recorded not as an apology, but as acknowledgement. The earth won, and we stopped insisting.